Imagine waking up one morning knowing that day you will be leaving the only country you have ever known. Imagine you are just a child, but your parents would not be coming with you. Imagine boarding a plane, not knowing if you will ever see your family again. But you are not alone. This is the journey of over 14,000 Cuban children, the largest recorded child refugee exodus in the Western Hemisphere. These are the children known as the Pedro Pans. The seeds of Operation Pedro Pan began after the 1959 Cuban Revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power. Support for Castro's revolution had grown in the late 1950s due to the appeal of his nationalistic rhetoric, but also because of the widespread corruption and brutality of the government led by Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Facing a popular rebellion led by Castro, Batista and a number of his supporters fled the island on January 1, 1959. Thousands of Cubans took to the streets to celebrate the end of Batista's authoritarian regime. The Cuban people were hopeful with the promise of free elections and change, yet instead of liberty and free elections, the new government transformed life in Cuba. 1960 brought the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. Family members, including children, were asked to spy on relatives and friends and report any counter-revolutionary activities. In April 1961, the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion by CIA-sponsored Cuban exiles dashed all hopes of a quick end to Castro's new regime. The following month, Castro would declare that communist doctrine would be the governing force in Cuba. Public schools were closed for 8 months so that new educational objectives could be implemented. The Education Reform Law of 1961 stated that the education of the Cuban children was solely the responsibility of the government. Students were encouraged to join the Literacy Brigade. Cuban children, separated from their families, were sent to the rural regions to teach the poor how to read and write. There was pressure to join government youth organizations, like the Union of Rebel Pioneers. Failure to participate in these programs would brand the children and their families as counter-revolutionaries. Parents feared the militarization of their children as student militias were formed and children were taught how to bear arms. Rumors of an impending Patria Potestad, a document that would allow government to assume guardianship of the children, sent parents into panic. The growing conflict between the Cuban government and the parents' right to choose how to educate their children came to a head.
So we began to worry immensely about the fate of the island in terms of who would win the soul of the Cubans, and it was beginning to be more confrontational. So we went from a state of great joy to concern to apprehension to mutual hostility.
Parents began to look for a way to get their children out of Cuba. In December 1960, Monsignor Brian Walsh, the director of the Catholic Welfare Bureau in Miami, met with State Department official Tracy Voorhees, who had been sent by President Eisenhower to evaluate the needs of the Cuban refugees. The State Department agreed to provide funds for the children as long as the Catholic Welfare Bureau would assume responsibility of caring for them until they could be reunited with their parents. Operation Pedro Pan was born. But by January 3, 1961, the U.S. had broken all diplomatic relations with Cuba before the necessary visas could be obtained. In an unprecedented move, the State Department granted Father Walsh the authority to issue visa waivers to the Cuban children at his discretion. Waivers were dispersed through an underground network in Cuba. By 1962, over 14,000 had come to the U.S. through the program. The decision to leave was not an easy one for the parents or the children, but many felt there was no alternative.
Because I was going to school, and my only choices would have been either to join the militia for the government and support the government, or being in outright opposition, which ran the risk, of course, of lengthy prison sentences.
So we were very aware that a communist Cuba would mean severe limitation in education for children, in the options for religion. So I was totally convinced that if communism would come to Cuba, the choices of Cuban parents, the choices for my own life, would be very limited.
After conversations with them, their hearts said no, but their heads said yes. My future in Cuba was very bleak.
Armed with visa waivers that allowed them U.S. entry, the Pedro Pan children began their journey alone to their new life in America. The children were met at the airport by representatives of the Catholic Welfare Bureau. Almost half of the children went directly to live with friends or relatives. The remainder reported to the Cuban Refugee Center, created to assist those who arrived with no money or place to stay. Unaccompanied minors were then transferred to camps throughout South Florida under the care of the Catholic Welfare Bureau.
And it was evident that it was a temporary moment. It was a facility that would be a halfway house between arriving from Cuba and being exported to a foster family.
The growing number of children at the camps overwhelmed the available facilities in South Florida. The Bureau began to search for foster homes across the country. Over 190 cities in the U.S. received Pedro Pan children. Most were placed with foster families, but some had to be placed in orphanages and boarding schools. Adjusting to life in America was a culture shock for most Pedro Pans. But while waiting for their families, children learned to adapt and make the most of their new surroundings.
I had the opportunity then to learn English at a fast pace, to finish high school, to contemplate the possibility of furthering my education in colleges nearby, and generally to begin to absorb and understand the culture of the United States.
The hopes of a brief separation for the families were dashed when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in October 1962. The 21-month exodus of children came to an abrupt end when all flights between Cuba and the U.S. were suspended. It would be 3 long years before the Freedom Flights of 1965 would resume and parents could attempt to leave Cuba and reunite with their children. Almost 90% of Pedro Pans reunited with their parents by June of 1966. Others were not as fortunate. There has been much debate about what Castro knew about the operation. He acknowledged in 2007 in his autobiography that the children had always been free to leave, but many believe his compromise of letting the children go was for his own benefit.
To disrupt children from leaving, from parents who were disaffected and who eventually might join them abroad, I think Castro saw that as a plus. I mean, you get rid of people who aren't going to think like me, people who aren't going to support me, and you might as well get them out as soon as possible.
Tremendous sacrifices were made by the parents and children of Operation Pedro Pan in the name of freedom. The conflict the parents experienced with the new regime left them with few options, and the compromise to send the children to America while the parents stayed behind took its toll. But the Pedro Pan parents, like parents today who make the difficult decision to send their children alone to a better life in the United States, felt it was inevitable in order to give their children the opportunities for a future that had been taken away from them in Cuba.
To be free is to have options, and I know of no better definition of freedom. Peter Pan Operation gave me an option, gave my mother an option.
In many ways, the burden and the suffering and the hardship that my parents, like many of the parents who agreed to send their children to the United States in the Pedro Pan program, were much greater than that of the children themselves. They effectively surrender their ability to do something for their children, to protect their children, with the hope that maybe the kindness of strangers would take care of their fate.